Well, I'm so pleased today that we have joined back with us on the show once again is national security expert Victoria Coates. Victoria serves as the vice president in the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy here at the Heritage Foundation, and she formerly served as a deputy national advisor to former President Donald Trump. Victoria, I want to jump right in here and talk about the latest in Ukraine and Russia. There's been a really interesting evolution of events over the past 2 weeks, where now Ukrainian troops are inside Russia. There's been an incursion into Russia. Explain exactly how they pulled this off.
Well, it's good to be with you as always, Virginia. And I think, this is a fascinating time for the Ukraine war. And the first thing I'll say, though, is we have heard nothing about this out of the administration. I searched in preparation for this podcast for any statement from the president, from the vice president, who's now, the nominee of the Democrat Party for president, from the Secretary of State, from the Secretary of Defense. Not a peep about the fact that the Ukrainians have done something rather extraordinary and gone into Russian territory, into the Kursk region, which is on the western border of Russia, right up against the eastern border of Ukraine, where the Russians are particularly active. That's where they've taken territory within sovereign Ukrainian boundaries. So about 2.5 weeks ago, they started this offensive. Their mission appears to be to disrupt Russian supply chains, and they're doing a good job of it. They've blown up 3 key bridges, and there are a couple of interesting things we can get into. The first is how the Russians respond, because it's one thing to be blowing up a bunch of things in Ukraine. It's quite another when Russian nationals see their things being blown up, obviously by the Ukrainians on Russian territory.
Or even having to flee and evacuate.
And they have to run from this. And so that word then gets out within Russia. And there's not as much that Vladimir Putin can do to tamp down Russians communicating with each other that he can do to prevent information from getting out of Ukraine. So that's one really interesting dynamic. Another is, given the silence of the Biden-Harris administration, are they being consulted on this? Because for the last 2.5 years, one of their key provisions is that American weapons will not be used against Russian targets. Now, you can debate the wisdom of that policy. The Russians haven't been particularly sensitive to Ukrainian borders, so I might not have made that provision, but it was how they responded to criticism that, oh my gosh, we're going to drift into World War III, is that they would prevent that from happening. But all of their rules keep getting broken. They don't need F-16s. Well, we're going to give them F-16s. They don't need javelins. Well, we're going to give them javelins. The incremental nature of this makes me think that former President Trump, when he says we are drifting towards World War III, that he may be right, because it's just not clear why this is a good idea now, and it wasn't a good idea a year ago. And if the Ukrainians can be successful here, what is the plan to consolidate that success? And could it become the basis for a negotiated conclusion to this war? That would have more leverage for the Ukrainians, which is what we have as Heritage have been advocating for since the beginning. So it's a very interesting development. On the surface, it is positive, to see the Ukrainians having some battlefield success, but it does raise a lot of questions.
So a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the silence from the Biden-Harris administration. Do you think that they're being silent because there are fears of World War III breaking out and they almost are like, we're going to stay quiet because we don't want to add to the tension? Or are there other reasons?
Well, they don't confide in me.
Shocking.
So yeah, it's hard to speculate. We did have a leaked document this week about Biden ordering a reconfiguration of the U.S. nuclear posture to potentially deal with a coordinated strike by China, North Korea, and Russia, which is a very frightening prospect. So clearly they do have concerns about escalation, but that didn't stop them from saying it was okay for the Ukrainians to do this with U.S. weapons. So that seems odd. Clearly they're all completely distracted by their political chaos that they've experienced over the last month. unprecedented, actions by fiat to install the vice president as the nominee. And there's been the equally bizarre campaign to prevent her from having any positions on anything, including Ukraine. You would think enterprising reporters would want to ask her, what do you think about this? And they're not even able to ask her what flavor of ice cream she likes at this point. So we are getting nothing out of them. And, with all of the exposure we have in other areas of the world, in the Middle East, obviously, and in the Pacific, who's balancing this strategically becomes the question. And, the president flew off to California. He's on vacation. Is the vice president, who's in the middle of her convention, making these decisions? Is she the policy driver here? In which case, we don't know what her policy is. It's very, very strange to just get nothing. No John Kirby, no nothing.
Blinken's in the Middle East.
Right.
And
who knows? Nobody knows where the Secretary of Defense is, apparently. But it's, it is a very, very odd scenario.
Yeah. How much intelligence is the U.S. providing Ukraine and Ukrainian troops? Because, again, this is a pretty big feat for them to pull off, not only getting into Russia, but they have advanced. I think the Associated Press, some of their latest numbers, where they've taken over 400 miles of territory within Russia. This is a lot of territory. How are they doing this? Or are they using U.S. intelligence?
I assume yes. We have a lot of surveillance capabilities that they don't have. And that should be part of any effort like this. Once the president had made the decision that we were going to arm, fund, and support the Ukrainian resistance, intelligence sharing is a natural part of that. Yeah. So one assumes that we are providing them with the targets, we're providing them with the kind of logistic information that they would need in collaboration with other regional, likely NATO allies. That's a pretty streamlined process.
Yeah. Well, and they're certainly not pulling back. If anything, they're getting a lot bolder. We saw early Wednesday morning, there was a drone attack where Russian officials said 45 drones, they were shot down over Russian territory. What do we know, for one, about that drone attack? And what exactly is Ukraine's endgame here?
Well, with the drone attack, those are becoming increasingly common.
Okay.
And drone warfare is a new frontier, literally, which all of our sort of adversaries are becoming extremely active in. Good news is we are also active in this space. The bad news is our drones, while very capable, tend to be very expensive. The Chinese mass produce cheap drones. And so we can wind up in a situation where it's costing us, in terms of a missile or a counter drone, millions of dollars to shoot down a $20,000 drone. And some of our colleagues here at Heritage, led by E.J. Antoni, have been doing some really good work on how much this is really costing us, because we've been told we're bleeding Russia dry. What may actually be happening is they're bleeding us dry through this mismatch in weapons. So the drone attack in and of itself is not shocking.
Okay.
We've seen other examples of this. I would want to know a lot more about what the drones are.
Yeah.
And in terms of end state, this goes to the broader silence. This came as a shock to everyone when they did this. As I said, I would hope that the goal is to get as much leverage as possible before any negotiations would take place. And I think that is a smart thing to do. That is what we should support if we're going to support this. Don't know that is happening. And I do think there is also a sort of public relations aspect of this that would be embarrassing to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
That, he had controlled the narrative for pretty much the whole summer in terms of, the Russians are entrenched. They're starting to retake some more territory. They're having success. That narrative's now been turned on its head. And so how they take advantage of that change. And finally, for me, it really begs the question of, if they can win this,
Yeah.
why did we not support them to win it 2.5 years ago? And if you go back and look at all of the statements that I've made, since I've been at, even before, but certainly since I've been at Heritage, have been for a plan to win the war. What is the desired end state? And what does do favorable terms for the United States and Ukraine look like?
Mm-hmm.
And the most recent, I believe, emergency supplemental had a requirement in it that the administration provide a strategy for Ukraine within a certain set amount of time. Well, they've blown through that deadline and clearly have no intention of providing any strategy to the Congress or to the American people. And if we are drifting towards a larger conflict, that's really scary.
So in your analysis, is it winnable for Ukraine? Because it feels like we've been in this gridlock for a long time. And now for the first time, there's sort of like a breaking from that gridlock. And we're looking at Ukraine that's now fighting on 3 fronts. In Eastern Ukraine, Russia obviously fighting also on 3 fronts now. Eastern Ukraine, the Black Sea, and now within Russian territory itself. Does Russia actually, or rather, does Ukraine actually have a chance of winning this thing?
Well, I mean, there's certainly always a chance.
Okay.
And the question is, has the administration and our major NATO partners been supplying Ukraine in a way to set them up for victory? And that's what's not clear to me. For starters, the administration has been so incremental. You don't hear them talking about victory. You hear them talking about as much as it takes for as long as it takes, which sounds to me like a recipe for an endless war.
Yeah.
And that never has been their goal, that they've wanted to do enough to prevent the Ukrainians from losing, but never enough to allow them to win. And I think we also have not had the very tough conversations we need to have with our European partners and allies. I mean, last month we had the NATO summit here in Washington, and everybody just collapsing all over each other, patting themselves on the back for the fact that half of our NATO allies now make their 2% commitment, sort of. I mean, that to me is a failure. I mean, is it better than it was 10 years ago? Yes. But if we have a war raging in Europe, and the Europeans, especially the biggest economies in the EU, France, Germany, and Italy, are not making their 2%. So love the Baltics. They're doing a great job. But even if they're at 3.5, it's not enough to shift the tide of this war. It means they are responsible nations taking care of their own security, but it's not going to allow the Ukrainians to beat the Russians. So unless and until, given our exposure elsewhere, the Europeans take the lead on this and show a sense of urgency that the bear is at the door, which it is. And it would behoove everyone if Putin didn't do this again. But that the bulk of that burden has to fall on them. And that should be the whole purpose of having NATO. And the whole purpose of having, U.S., yes, contributions and leadership in NATO, but we can't be the first and last funder of European wars. Yeah. I mean, that's where they have to step up to the plate, and it's been 2.5 years and they haven't done it. So, yes, Ukraine could win. I don't know that they are being enabled to win.
Victoria, I know you have to go here in a second. I want to, while we have you here, just briefly ask for an update on Israel. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel earlier this week. He's been in Qatar and Egypt talking about these negotiations. Where does a peace deal stand?
Well, the administration is still flogging the May announcement that the president made about a ceasefire deal, sort of a sequential ceasefire deal, which has been rejected by Hamas at least 3 times, if not 4, but they keep pushing on it. And it's interesting. There was a leak that the announcement of that ceasefire deal in May, that the president originally had been prepared to make a much tougher statement on Israel, on the necessity of Israel negotiating for a Palestinian state, getting to a ceasefire, stopping their talk of victory, that they needed to end the war now, in language that really echoes some language from Obama in 2013 and his administration. And a lot of these people are serving now. Philip Gordon, Vice President Harris's national security advisor, was one of the architects of that on the Obama NSC. So you're starting to hear these echoes and these leaks that suggest that Harris is going to take a much stronger tone on Thursday against Israel than even Biden has up until now. So on the ceasefire, it looks like Hamas has rejected it again. Hamas is the problem here. Obviously, they could have peace tomorrow if they wanted it. They could have not started the war in the first place. If I were doing this, I would signal very strongly to Qatar and Egypt, who are conducting these negotiations because we're asking them to, that what we're negotiating now are peace terms that Hamas has lost, and they can sue for terms. That we are no longer going to have an ambiguous ceasefire that they won't adhere to anyway, because they never do, and that will just put Israel back into a vulnerable position. And I just close by saying, there are still at least 5 Americans being held hostage in Gaza as we speak. We had 6 bodies discovered this week. It is a perilous situation. And the Democrats in Chicago have yet to use the word Israel. They won't say it. They won't talk about it. And certainly not name our hostages or any of the others that are still in that cruel captivity. And so that is a huge choice for American voters going into the election of, where do you stand on this issue? And where would you want your next president to stand on it? Because it is a case of black and white here.
Heritage Foundation national security expert Victoria Coates. Victoria, thank you for your time, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you, Virginia.